So we've already entered the 20th century. We have looked, specifically last week, at artists who are moving toward non-objective and creating non-objective art. But there, in some ways, is a parallel movement, and a movement that is reacting against any sort of tradition in art. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. And that's the movement called Dada, D-A-D-A, Dada. This is taken from an illustration from a journal that's actually called Cannibal. And it is described as a portrait of Cézanne by Francis Picabia, the French painter, who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, believe it or not, in Paris, and who began his career producing Impressionist-style paintings. But this work from around 1916 is far removed from the sedate 19th century tradition. It is said to be not only a portrait of Cézanne, which is written across the top of it, but notice along the sides, it is a portrait of Rembrandt, it is a portrait of Renoir, and it is a nature morte, which means a still life painting. It is all of those things, but of course it isn't. It's a symbol for the old order, for that which is being rethought and in essence thrown out. It is an allusion to the fact that even Cézanne, the great Cézanne's painting from nature, makes him a descendant of the old Renaissance, naturalistic, old masters painters. This work reflects a total rejection of tradition or any sort of respect for the past. It is basically a photograph of a stuffed monkey who's been nailed to a board, and all of those words, those statements have been painted around the monkey. It reflects no respect for the past. This is a photo of Francis Picabia, who created that work, the portrait of Cézanne. Picabia said something that tears my heart in several pieces. Art is useless and impossible to justify. Art is useless and impossible to justify. No quotes on the final. Good question. This statement is obviously nihilistic. Nihilistic, nihilism. Nihilism seeks to deny tradition and ultimately advocates the destruction of the old order to make way for the new. Nihilists don't give a darn about the past. They're not interested in it. In fact, the only interest might be to ignore it or to destroy it. And ultimately, what we're seeing here is an attitude that will lead to the movement called Dada. The late 19th century poet and playwright Alfred Jarry, you see his name there, Alfred Jarry, was the Dadaist symbol and model for the destruction of traditional standards of taste. The Dadaists admired Jarry and certainly never tired of telling the story about how Jarry's play, called Ubu Roi, Ubu the King, R-O-I is king in French, was a representation of all that they believed in. Ubu Roi was a story about an army officer who aspires to be the king of Poland. It was written at the end of the 19th century by the poet and playwright and artist, Jarry. It was presented on the Paris stage only once in 1896, and it was subsequently closed. And the reason it was closed after its one-night stand was that when the main character, Ubu, who's called Père Ubu, Father Ubu, a rather grotesque, large figure, comes out on stage at the very beginning of the play, and he's walking around and he's looking at the audience. And this is a very well-dressed Parisian audience. This is 1896. And he looks at them and he shouts, "Merde! Shit!" Merde in French, shit. He shouts this at the audience. There are ladies in the audience and gentlemen. It's 1896. People are absolutely outraged. And they get up, they walk out. A few stay, but most are very shocked by what has just happened. It is a representative of this kind of nihilism, this rejection of anything that might be considered appropriate or traditional. It advocates this idea that one should destroy whatever was considered appropriate in the past. What is this movement known as Dada? Well, it begins very close to the beginning of World War I. In fact, it develops in neutral Zurich, Switzerland in 1916. World War I begins in 1914 and continues to 1918. It began with a number of intellectuals and writers. In fact, it was a literary movement first and foremost, again, based on rejecting tradition and searching for new subject matter and new content. Zurich, Switzerland was the first important center of the movement. And Dada was a nonsense word supposedly chosen at random from a dictionary, reflecting the whole feeling of madness and rejection of tradition, which is what these artists and writers were interested in. I found a short, it's about 3 minutes long, description of some of the individuals associated with the Dada movement. It's called the ABCs of Dada. And what I find particularly interesting is that a number of the Dadaists, the early Dadaists in Zurich, were writers and poets. And they made up a new language. And they would have meetings, and they would have open houses, and they would recite their poetry. And it was all nonsense. So this is, I thought, what gives you a taste of Dada. And it actually begins with an interview with Hans Richter, who was an artist, teacher, and filmmaker who wrote a first-hand account of the Dada movement. And he called it anti-art, which is certainly true. Actually, that was appropriate.
Professor Hanslick. I don't have to explain Dada. You all know what Dada is. But it was created as a movement of protest in Zurich. Protest not only in the world of art, but also in the world of politics. There were immigrants from Germany, from Romania, Janko and Sarah, from Austria, Werner. They were not only against the war, but they wanted to express a new kind of mentality. They wanted to include arts into the fight for a new ethic.
Revolted by the slaughter of World War I, we devoted ourselves in Zurich to the fine arts. While far away there was artillery thunder, we sang, painted, glued together and wrote poems for our hearts and tips. Hans Up.
In this house on February the 5th, 1916, Cabaret Voltaire was opened and Dadaism founded.
From Hugo Ball's diaries, 1916, May 24. We were all there when Janko arrived with his masks, and everyone immediately tried one on. Then something strange happened. The masks not only immediately called for specific costumes, they also dictated a very theatrical behavior that verged on madness. 1916, June 23. I have invented a new kind of verse. Verses without words, or sound poems. The first of these verses I read out tonight. I have constructed a special costume for the occasion.
From Zara's Zurich Chronicle, 1918, July 23. Miser Hall, Tristan Zara Soiree. Manifesto, Antithesis, Thesis, Anti-Philosophy. 1919, April 9, Kaufleuten Hall. Non plus ultra, 1,500 persons filled the hall. From July 1917 on, the magazine Dada appears in Zurich. In January 1920, Zara goes to Paris, where the last numbers of Dada are printed.
Teuber Arp Sophie, wife of Hans Arp. As a painter, had great influence on the Zurich Dadaism, paper and cloth pictures, embroidery, Dada heads, marionettes, dancer.
Soldier and Army at the same time, 1918, marionette figure. Elementary forms, 1917, gouache and embroidery. She loved dancing, and for a time she preferred this to her creative work. Sophie Teuber was a teacher in the Zurich School of Arts and Crafts. Her teaching made her essential work and mind possible. I must remind the reader that we lived in Dada times, and that the Dadaists had an extremely bad reputation. Thus, the head of the School of Arts and Crafts intimated to Sophie she was to give up taking part in the Dadaist manifestations, or else, as they say in Switzerland, she would lose her teacher's job. She now saw herself compelled to wear a mask and pseudonym for her dance act, Hans Up.
Sarah Tristan co-founded Dada in Zurich 1916, editor of the magazines Cabaret Voltaire and Dada, co-founder of Paris Dada. Later on collaborated with the Surrealists.
Diarrhea is also a sentiment. War, business, poetic element, infernal propeller economic spirit, Germain Bautiste, national anthem, posters, Raymond tossed on stage, sandwich outburst, Tristan.
Sana Walter. Editor of the magazine Sirius. Main work, Let's the Locker on Hanover 1920. Last heard of in 1922 in the USSR, where he had gone as a convinced communist. Schwitter's Coat. From 1918 on, developed his one-man Dadaism, which he called Maths. Emigrated to Norway in 1937. His math structure in Hanover 1943 destroyed in an air raid. Math structure number 2 in Lysaker, Norway, burned 5 children at play in 1951. Maths structure number 3 in Little Langdale near Ambleside, England, didn't get beyond initial stage.
Maths picture 1C 1920.
He was not against art. As a matter of fact, he created a new art form with his collage, which was completely different from anything we had seen before. And he explained to Hausmann, for instance, that he nailed his paintings and he pasted his collage in order to enrich normal paintings.
Uns. Sturmbevölkerung, Entlastungskriegen. Es ging Brunnen an Berliner und noch etwas stattfindendes am Kopfe. Reichsgerichtsprozesse gegen die Staatsaußenangehörigen werden alle Personen, die imstande sind, Beweiskräftiges zu liefern oder darauf hinzuweisen, die durch die Presse bekannt wird. Die Liste der Beschuldigungen finden von Mittwoch, den 11. bis wegen erwartenden Eingänge finden im Abenddatum Kriegsschauplatz mit
Kurt Schwitters spricht sein Gedicht
Kurt Schwitters reading his poem to Anna Blume, recorded in 1922.
Meiner 27 Sinne, ich liebe dir. Du deiner, dich, dir, ich, dir, du, mir, dir. Das gehört beiläufig nicht hierher. Wer bist du, ungezähltes Frauenzimmer? Du bist du? Die Menschen sagen, du wärst. Lass sie sagen. Sie wissen nicht, wie der Kirchturm steht.
spricht Teile seiner Sonate mit Urlauten.
Der Weber, Fünfer. Weber, Fünfer.
At first I tried to create new art forms out of the remains of older cultures. This led to Mechs painting, a new form of painting that uses any sort of material, pelican colors as well as rubbish. Thus I experienced the revolution in its funniest form and am termed a Dadaist without being one. Kurt Schwitters, 1926.
Invitation to Matt Soiree. Original poetry. Grotesques, satires, lyrics, epic poetry. Dada, primal sound poetry. Dancing and refreshments after the lecture. When you go home, tell everyone what a jolly time you've had.
And thus the word Mechs was born.
Starting with the number Holland Dada, Schwitters publishes from 1923 until 1932 in his own März Verlag, all in all 21 numbers of his März magazine. In it he propagated his März ideas, März typography in conjunction with Lisitsky, März architecture, März poetry, März and Dada friends, März painting, März structure, März theatre, März advertising, and himself. From about 1922 onwards, Schwitters turned away from Dadaism and inclined to the Dutch Gestapo movement. Richter Hans came to Zurich at the end of 1916, championed the abstract films together with Egger.
So I thought that was really an excellent sort of taste of Dada, particularly because it talked about both the language aspect, the literary aspect, and the art. And again, I think it reinforces what I talked about in terms of nihilism, rejection of anything from the past. Dada was a reaction to the devastation and slaughter brought on by the first major world war, the First World War, 1914-1918. A new consciousness was apparent in literature and then in art. And it was particularly youth who were expressing their reaction to the spreading hysteria and madness of their world, the Western world, Western Europe, at war, with literally the mutilation of thousands of young men, with trench warfare and mustard gas poisoning. This is the Battle of the Somme, July 1916. And if you didn't die from inhaling the mustard gas, you were debilitated for the rest of your life. So you can see the gas masks that were worn. Mustard gas has been outlawed in terms of war. Of course, there are other things that can be used now, but it's been outlawed. This is an anti-war poster of the period from the movement in London. So what's going on in Chicago right now with the meeting of NATO countries and the anti-war demonstrations, there's nothing new in that. It was very much a part of the First World War. The Dadaists felt that if reason and logic had led Western Europe to the disaster of World War, then humans should turn away from reason and logic, as it didn't bring you anything that was positive, and turn to anarchy, irrationality, and negation of the status quo. A supposedly rational world had gone to war, so perhaps an irrational world would embrace peace. An irrational world would avoid confrontation. This is one of the important catalysts, one of the important aspects in terms of an understanding of the attitude of Dadaists. Dada's reputation of Dada's repudiation of traditional visual arts paradoxically turned out to be a tremendous stimulus to art. Because what happened, as you saw from that very brief video, is you see the imagination of these individuals coming in, thinking about art in very different ways, promoting chance, rejecting reason, encouraging any kind of unusual creativity. The Dadaists were opposed to any organized program in the arts. They didn't want to become a movement in the history of art. That was anathema to them. Of course, too bad. they are. They didn't want to be labeled as a coherent group. And certainly the variety of visual arts and styles that come out of the Dadaist movement indicate that it's hard to see them as a coherent group. But in terms of attitude, three factors are important in their total production. The first is what they called bruitisme. So what is bruit in French? Anyone know? Noise. Noise. So noise music, noise poetry. Simultaneity. Forgot I had my arrows. Meaning that whatever you create, multiple things should be going on, multiple stimulation. And again, if reason brings us to war, then chance must be a much better way, a much more logical approach in life. Said one adherent of the movement, quote, All of us were enemies of the old rationalistic bourgeois art, which we regarded as symptomatic of a culture about to crumble with war. We loathed every form of art that merely imitated nature, and we admired instead the Cubists and Picasso. So you begin to see then the context of the work by Francis Picabia, the portrait of Cézanne that we looked at the very beginning of this overview of Dada. The first major artist to produce Dada works out of Zurich, Switzerland, which was the center for the development of the Dada movement, was Jean Arp, also called Hans Arp. In Switzerland, they speak German and French. So Jean or Han, John, Jean, or Hans, Hans, Arp. Arp had been experimenting with geometric abstraction based in Cubism. But by 1915, he decided to abandon traditional oil painting because the vocabulary, the subject matter, what could be done in that very old-fashioned medium seemed to have been done. He began to make what he called automatic drawings, where he let his pencil move freely over a piece of paper, and then in a secondary intellectual process, he completed a work of art by making ink shapes out of those patterns. So I don't know if you've ever done that with a, with a pen, but just you have a piece of paper and you kind of just let your arm kind of float around it, and then he would look at it, and even though it was quite random, he would make a drawing, a final drawing from it. This automatic drawing seems to have been inspired by the branches of a tree. In some ways, it seems quite conservative. It is inscribed in 1916 in the lower left-hand corner, Hans Arp. Arp stated that he wanted to avoid any reminder of paintings that were characteristic of a pretentious, self-satisfied world. And again, a world which had been brought to war. He then took up the Cubist idea of collage. Collage was one of the most inventive aspects of Cubism. You remember it inspired Picasso and Braque even to move toward a new phase of Cubism called synthetic Cubism. Arp's collages were not rationally organized and formulated, and you have to remember that. With Braque and Picasso, they're working very diligently, very carefully to create the work in the form of collage. But for Arp, it was experimentation. It was the idea of chance. And so he described how works such as squares or collage arranged according to the laws of chance actually occurred. And what he said is he would take a couple of colors of paper and he would rip them apart, and then he would flip the pieces down onto the floor, onto another ground, another background, dropping it down. And that's the chance aspect, because he's really not controlling. The paper is floating down and landing. He's not controlling where it's landing. And then the second phase of the collage was, in fact, to take the randomness of chance and do a conscious rearranging of the form. So among other things, the first thing that I notice here is nothing overlaps, which would seem to be almost impossible if you're just throwing down pieces of paper. And everything seems to be relatively parallel, perpendicular pieces to one another. So Arp agreed that he used chance in these works, but only as a point of departure. This is a relatively small work. It's about 13 by 19 inches. One of the most creative aspects of Dada then was chance. It seemed to Dadaists that in the past, artists attempted to control every aspect of their composition, from the choice of the subject to the medium, and now they wanted chance to play a very decisive role. Kurt Schwitters, who was mentioned in the video we just looked at, was the leading exponent of Dada in Hanover, Germany. Hanover. It is Schwitters who formulated his own version of Dada, which he called Merz. And you remember, it is thought that he came up with that word because he saw it in a newspaper or a periodical article, and it was part of Commercial or Commerzbank, and he just cut the Merz part out of the larger word. He loved the idea of using scraps of newspaper and words from newspapers. In fact, that is, of course, something that he derived from a knowledge of French collage. In line with the Dadaist anti-establishment concept that anything could be art, Schwitters composed his collages of trash, rubbish, what he could pick up in the street, in the gutter, cigarette wrappers, ticket stubs, newspaper. His works have been described as the refuse of a ruined world, organized ultimately into compositions of great beauty. So this is Merz 19 from 1920. Schwitters, as you also heard in the video, liked to build Merz as well. So he went beyond simply the tradition of the single surface to multiple surfaces. He turned his own house into a Merz sculpture, a fantastic labyrinth of partitions and tunnels and excrescences. He would find an interesting piece of wood or cast off of some material. He would bring it back into his house, and he would nail it or glue it to the wall. He called these transformations of rooms in his house Märzbau. Bau is house, Märzbau. This is a Märzbau from around 1923. The photo was taken in 1931 or 1932. He continued to multiply endlessly the Märzbau within his house until he was forced to leave Germany by the Nazis in the 1930s. Schwitters had a tremendous sense of humor, as did many of the Dadaist artists. When he was introduced to people, he would say, "I am a painter, I nail my paintings together." As you heard in the video, the original two Märzbau were destroyed. He started a second one in Great Britain before his death in 1948. Demanding, in essence, complete freedom, separation from the past, the Dadaists provided the modern world with some of the most bizarre and shocking images ever realized in art. But again, it was an extraordinarily creative period. It's a period that literally resonates in terms of the development of modern art throughout the 20th century. Because Dadaists are the ones who, not pop artists, but Dadaists, began to talk about, began to realize, began to formulate the idea about the gap between art and life. And why does there have to be a gap? Why does there have to be a separation? Marcel Duchamp's association with Dada would produce some extraordinary results. Now, we've talked about Marcel Duchamp already as an artist who has been associated with the Cubist movement. You remember he had some problems with his nude descending a staircase, number 2, because it showed movement, and Cubism was not about movement. But by the time he was 25, at the time he finished this painting, Duchamp had begun to reject traditional painting altogether. This work would become one of his most classic paintings, one of his most legitimate conservative paintings in terms of an expression of his art. In fact, after 1912, he painted very little. But beginning in 1913, Duchamp began producing a series of works made of or consisting solely of found objects. Now keep in mind, he is in essence a kind of precursor of the Dada movement, which began in 1916. The whole idea of arbitrarily selecting something and then saying that it's art is something that fascinated Duchamp in his desire to rethink what art should be. And he was also very interested in chance, which becomes an important aspect of the Dada movement. Duchamp produced what are known as ready-mades. One word, compound word, ready-made. He chose objects that were machine manufactured, said that he was totally indifferent to whether they had any kind of aesthetic or visual component. He didn't care. He just wanted to demonstrate that anything could be art if an artist said it was art. One humorous ready-made was this one called In Advance of a Broken Arm. The problem with this one is no one in Southern California knows what this is. Well, you know it's a shovel, but what kind of a shovel? Yes. It's a snow shovel, exactly. It's a snow shovel that he is making a joke about. The other most famous early ready-made was called Fountain. He signed it with a pseudonym, R. Mutt. R. Mutt, M-U-T-T. And he submitted it in the exhibition of the New York Society of Independent Artists because Duchamp had left Europe for a period of time and was living in New York. The work called Fountain by R. Mutt was rejected, even though the show was open to all artists and had no jury. It was rejected by those who were in charge of setting up the show. The Fountain was rejected on the grounds that it was immoral. So do you want to see the Fountain? It's a men's urinal. It's also upside down. It's a very old-fashioned men's urinal. You see the water, the pipe would come through here, and here's the front cup area that catches the urine that then would go down the drain. Well, what did he do? He sort of turned it in a different direction. You see that he signed it. Duchamp found it absolutely absurd that the work was rejected on the grounds that it was immoral, because he argued that men see these urinals every day of their lives. So I guess they're looking at immorality every day. He also stated that plumbing supplies companies exhibit and display different types of urinals in their businesses. But of course, it had been rejected because it didn't fit the traditional concept of what art should be. Duchamp, of course, is saying this is sculpture, but it was a nihilistic statement about art, rejecting all of the traditions. Now, I must say that there were a number of critics at this early period who would look at the snow shovel, who would look at the urinal, and they would argue that Duchamp actually has an eye, that he's brilliant. He sees the beauty in these objects, that there is an aesthetic quality, that they were chosen specifically for their formal attributes. And he said, that's crap. The Fountain was the most notorious of all of Duchamp's ready-mades, except perhaps for his ready-made aided, A-I-D-E-D, ready-made aided. It was executed after his return to France in 1919, at the end of the First World War. And ready-made aided is a picture postcard of the most famous painting in the Louvre Museum. And he gave it a new title. It's called La Joconde. That's the French title for Leonardo's Mona Lisa. But you see he scrawled at the bottom of the postcard, LHOOQ, and he gave her a mustache and a goatee. Okay. So believe it or not, people were outraged. But I know, it's incredible, but he had done something else, and this is always Duchamp. There are these very personal, multi-level inside jokes, because LHOOQ just sounds like some initials in English. But if you say it in French, it's a sentence. Elle a chaud au cœur. Elle a chaud au cœur. She's got a hot ass. So he's explaining the smile, perhaps? Years later, after insulting the greatest masterpiece of the greatest Renaissance painter, Duchamp signed an unaltered print of the Mona Lisa, and he gave it a new title, Rasé, shaved. One of Duchamp's most enigmatic works is one I always go to see when I'm in Philadelphia. And that's my daughter behind it, and I told her to stand there because I wanted you to get a sense of how this works. This is called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, the Large Glass. So there is both meaning and nonsense in the title. The work was created over a long period of time, 1915 to 1923. It's almost 9 feet tall by about 5 feet 7 inches wide. Duchamp began developing ideas for the work as early as 1912. You remember in 1912 he said, "I've had it with oil painting. Everything's been done. It's boring." He was fascinated with the possibility in art of suggesting the fourth dimension. Again, what's the fourth dimension? Time. Time. Duchamp took a large piece of glass and he began to paint imagery on it in the top of the glass and the bottom of the glass. He loved the idea of glass because a glass surface eliminated one traditional aspect of painting, and that is, what am I going to paint in the background? Because the background behind the actual subject, it's transparent, and the background is made up by wherever the large glass is set up. So it's always going to change. There is that idea of chance and the chance environment for the background of the main imagery. The large glass has been explained as representing an elaborate mating ritual between the bride in the upper half of the work. Don't feel concerned if you are a bit lost. And the bachelors in the lower part of the work. The problem is we don't seem to have any kind of traditional human figuration here. The humans are machine-like forms, and in fact the machine-like forms indicate the artist's fascination, increasing fascination with technology in the context of the early 20th century. So there are machines. This looks like a sort of a primitive chocolate grinder here, almost like a chemical mass of machines and elements. And then the same is true up above. When the large glass went off to be exhibited, it was returned to Duchamp after several months. And when it was opened, it had been broken in transport, acquiring that network of cracks across the surface from the top, spinning over to the left, and then down through the bottom. Duchamp is said to have looked at the work and have been absolutely delighted because chance had intervened and broken the piece. He actually supposedly said, and this is so perfect, it sounds like him, well, it's finished. Although Marcel Duchamp claimed that he had ceased all formal artistic activity after 1923 in order to devote his life to chess, he continued to create in a way which was more cerebral than visual. In fact, he said, "Art is a habit-forming drug. Art has absolutely no existence as veracity or truth. People speak of it with great religious reverence, but I don't see why it is so much revered. Art is only one occupation among others. It is not all my life, far from it." So there he is, and that's a chess set designed by an artist friend of his. And I found another kind of interesting interview with Duchamp, who died only in 1968, I think, well, only. So let's listen to him for a minute.
I don't care about the word art because it's been so discredited into the word.
But you in fact contributed to the discrediting, didn't you? Quite deliberately.
Deliberately, yes. So I really want to get rid of it. There's a sort of unnecessary adoration of art today, which I find unnecessary. And I think, I don't know, this is a difficult position because I've been in it all the time and still want to get rid of it, you see. And I cannot explain everything I do because I do things or people do things and don't know why they do it.
You couldn't overlook a urinal on public display in an exhibition because at that point you'd have to ask yourself, is this a work of art? You'd have to ask the central question that a ready-made forces you to ask. You could no longer just walk by it and pretend even to yourself that it wasn't art. Here it was in the middle of an exhibition, treated as a work of art.
My idea was to choose an object that wouldn't attract me either by its beauty or by its ugliness. To find a point of indifference in my looking at it, see? Of course, you might say I find any number of those, but at the same time, it's not so much because it's hard and difficult. After a while, when you look at something, it becomes very interesting. You can even like it. And the minute I liked it, I would discard it.
Les premiers régiments vraiment pas qu'il y a 1913. La première chose, c'est une roue de bicyclette. Que j'ai simplement mis sur un tabouret, puis je vais regarder tourner. Alors là, il y avait en plus, dans celui-là, il y avait en plus du résumé, il y avait le fait qu'il tournait. C'est-à-dire le mouvement était compris dans l'idée.
So they don't have the translation, so anyway, I thought it'd be interesting for you to see him. One final Dadaist. By 1916, the American-born artist Man Ray, by the way, born Emanuel Rebninsky, was living in New York City and collaborating with Duchamp and Francis Picabia on Dada works of art. By 1919, Man Ray was using an airbrush normally reserved for commercial graphic work to paint on canvas. He loved it because he could use an airbrush and he never had to touch the canvas. So again, that removes the tradition of the artist applying with a brush or other tool to the surface. Man Ray is most famous for some of his assisted ready-mades, such as The Gift This is a replica of the lost original of 1921. So the irony here, and he's picking up that humor from Duchamp, is that this is an iron. But can you iron something with it? Well, I suppose you could, but you would destroy whatever you tried to iron. Man Ray is most famous for his contributions to modern photography in the form of what are known as rayographs. This is rayograph 1922. A rayograph is a cameraless photograph made by placing objects on or near sensitized paper and then just exposing it to light. This was considered an automatic process, a process that involved chance then, and that created some highly abstract, strange, and in some ways perhaps highly symbolic images. I see some tacks, by the way, up in the left-hand corner. By the early 1920s, a number of French artists and writers were growing disillusioned with Dada because it seemed to have been institutionalized. Dada artists were showing in exhibitions, and a number of both Dadaist artists and other French artists wanted to move in another direction, and it would eventually begin a new movement called Surrealism. Okay.